such a splendid turnout this evening for the screening of the film Obsession and for the discussion which will follow. In a moment I'm going to invite the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities to say some words of greeting. Just let me very briefly outline what will be the order of our proceeding this evening. After the Dean's remarks, I will say a few words of background as to why we're screening this film and what it is about. I also have a surprise this evening which I won't yet reveal to you. We will then proceed to the screening, which is approximately 1 hour. And following that, we'll have Professor Bernard Lewis will come up here, will deliver his lecture of about 25 minutes to half an hour, and then we will open it to discussion. So without further ado, it's my great privilege and pleasure to invite a colleague and a friend, and now the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Israel Bartal. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Professor Lewis, Professor Wistrich, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have with us Professor Bernard Lewis, a leading authority in the study of Islam. Bernard Lewis is the Cleveland Dodge Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. And mind this, he was born in London in 1916 and received his PhD in 1939 from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London, specializing in the history of Islam. Lewis served in the Royal Armored Corps and Intelligence Corps in 1940-1941 and was then appointed to the Foreign Office. Following World War II, he was appointed to the newly established chair in Near and Middle Eastern History at the School of Oriental and African Studies, 1949. In 1974, Professor Lewis began to serve a joint position at Princeton University and the Institute for Advanced Study. In that year, he was awarded a PhD honoris causa from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, an event which I remember. He retired from Princeton in 1986. Well, there's not much light here. Okay. 1986, and was then affiliated with Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, until 1990. His published works have been required reading for anyone researching the history of the Middle East and Islam. Among his many books are, and I will mention only a few of them, The Arabs in History, 1950, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, 1963, which was translated into Hebrew and was published by the Hebrew University Magnus Press several years ago, The Muslim Discovery of Europe, 1982, Semites and Anti-Semites, 1986, The Political Language of Islam, 1988, Islam and the West, 1993, Islam in History, 1993, The Future of the Middle East, 1997, What Went Wrong, The Clash Between Islam and Modernity in the Middle East, 2002, The Crisis of Islam, Holy War and Unholy Terror, 2003, and From Babel to Dragomans, Interpreting the Middle East, 2004. Professor Lewis's lifelong work has been recognized for its importance to scholars and policymakers. In November 2006, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal presented by U.S. President George W. Bush. He has also been the recipient of other important awards, including the Technion's Harvard Prize, and he is a member of the British Academy, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we are going to watch Obsession, a film directed and edited by Wayne Copping and produced by Raphael Shore. This is a documentary based on footage from major radical Muslim ideologues and interviews with Arab and Western experts on the phenomenon that threatens the world today. Professor Robert Wistrich, head of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, helped to edit and was an academic advisor to the film, and appears in the film along with other scholars and politicians. As the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University, I would like to thank Professors Loois and Wistrich for their scholarly output, which I am sure will add to our knowledge of one of the most important political and security problems of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Israel, for those remarks, and let me now just say a few words by way of introduction to this film, which I'm very proud to have been associated with as a historical advisor and in helping in some way to shape the final edit. It's a film which, as you will see, provides a very stark portrayal. You mentioned there wasn't too much light here. Wait until we start watching this film. A very stark portrayal of the hate propaganda, the techniques of indoctrination, even of young children, which take place today in the Arab world and even among our closest neighbors. Without that, it is impossible to understand the mindset of the suicide bombers, and as we all know, tragically, once again, they have struck in the southern city of Eilat. What is often overlooked when we follow our news broadcasts is that all of this is done in the name of an immoral and inhuman ideology, but it is an ideology. And one of the things which this film seeks to explore is its global nature. This is a film about global jihad. Global jihad, which by definition can strike anywhere, just as it has struck so many times in Israel. We have seen its effects in New York, in Madrid, in London, in Bali, and many other parts of the world, including very much the Arab world. As we know, behind the jihad stand many diverse groupings. It's not only Al-Qaeda, it's not only Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, even the Fatah, but many lesser known to us, lesser known jihadist organizations. And one of the things the film tries to do is to bring some kind of intellectual cohesion to understanding this worldwide phenomenon. Every place it may have its local reasons, motivations, grievances, but it is a worldwide phenomenon. And as we have seen with shocking frequency in this part of the world, as at other times and places in history, the path from violent words to murder, and indeed to mass murder, is often a short one. Let me just mention the words not so long ago, 23rd of July 2006, of the President of Iran, who said, "I invite the faithful to wait for good news. We shall soon witness the elimination of the Zionist stain of shame." And 2 weeks earlier, in a more general warning, he said, "If an explosion occurs, it will also burn those who helped create Israel over the past 60 years." These are only some of many pronouncements by President Ahmadinejad, even among his more moderate quote-unquote statements. But they are genocidal in their logic, and we ignore them at our peril. There is another facet to this film, which Professor Bernard Lewis will elaborate on in his remarks later, namely anti-Semitism, specifically Islamist anti-Semitism. And that is one of the reasons why our center, why the Vidal Sassoon Center regarded it as particularly important to bring this particular documentary to the wider knowledge and attention of the Israeli public, because it shows in a very graphic manner, in the way that only films can do, the portrayal, the lurid portrayal of Jews and of Israel, as well as the United States, in television programs, on the internet, in sermons, in school books, in caricatures. As someone who has had some experience of writing screenplays and editing films, I can say that this was the experience that was the most shocking of all the ones that I had had until this point, although I dealt with this subject over so many years. And I cannot understand why to this day this film has not yet been shown on Israeli television. It has been shown widely in the United States, but I won't enter into that tonight. It is really a surrealistic horror story, and yet it's not surrealistic, it's real. It's all too real. And its message is more timely than ever before. An Iran on the verge of nuclear weapons, determined to wipe Israel off the map. A Hezbollah as the longer arm of Iran, which we failed to destroy during the last summer's war. The utter chaos in the Palestinian Authority, still governed, if that's the word, by Hamas. The mayhem and the slaughter every day in Iraq, and we could go on and on. But the point is that we're all in this together, because ultimately, if the Muslim world is ablaze, we cannot escape the conflagration. And equally, it seems to me, the more they continue, as this film shows, to demonize and dehumanize Israel, the Jews, and the West, the more this will rebound in the form of terrorism that acts as a Frankenstein monster and ultimately turns on the perpetrators themselves. I said I had a surprise, and it really is a surprise, I'm not making this up. Until yesterday, I did not know that the director of this film would be with us tonight, because he lives in South Africa, and it's quite exceptional that he just happens to be here because he's leaving tomorrow. And therefore, it's a great pleasure for me to invite Wayne Copping up on the stage just to say a few words of greetings to you. Please give him a round of applause.
Good evening. I'm certainly going to be brief because we are here tonight to hear from these great scholars, Professor Wistrich and Professor Loois. And it's a real privilege for me actually to be here tonight. And, you know, if you had to look at the readings of Professor Wistrich or Professor Loois 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, if you had to look at their writings and what is happening today, you might be forgiven for thinking that these men are prophets. But they're not prophets. These men are just able to accurately identify the current events of today and to understand how those events are going to manifest in the years to come. And that's the greatness of these gentlemen. And the film has been shown on Fox TV several times. It's been featured on CNN, MSNBC, all over the world, countless blogs and internet sites. And people say a lot of things about the film. But what they don't say is that the film is wrong, that the film is inaccurate, that we're making big mistakes. And to that, we, in a large respect, we credit the source materials of Professor Loois. You may or may not know this, but we poured through a lot of your material. And certainly Professor Wistrich, who eventually became the historical advisor on the film, and so we owe a great debt of gratitude to you gentlemen, and we're all privileged to be here tonight with these scholars, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Every single country in the world is dealing with this on one level or another.
When I saw the second airplane hit, I knew Jihad has come to America.
They wish to strike down the West.
سيأتي يوم نحكم فيه أمريكا. سيأتي يوم نحكم فيه بريطانيا ونحكم فيه كل العالم.
First of all, I'd like to express my admiration for the very professional job that Wayne Copping did on this film. He was too modest to mention many of the remarkable reviews that this film achieved in the United States. Controversial as it is, nobody questioned the professionalism with which this was made. You heard the introduction from the Dean regarding the illustrious and very eminent scholar Bernard Lewis, who is so kindly agreed to be with us here tonight. I would like to mention just in passing that when I was a young student in London, this is something we share because Bernard Lewis is a Londoner. I wasn't born in London, but I am a Londoner in many ways. I had the pleasure to listen to a lecture of his. This was 1970 at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. This was before he crossed the Atlantic to go to Princeton. And it's one of those experiences that you can never forget, this wonderful fluency, elegance, eloquence, and dry humor, British humor. And I'm sure that we'll hear a little bit of that later on. There's also something else which is often forgotten that struck me at that time, which is a certain affection, I would say, for the Arab peoples and Muslims in the Middle East, despite the often rather dark historical record which is unavoidable and which any scholar of Middle Eastern history has to face. And I think that's important in the context of tonight. I should also mention that Bernard Lewis has written very eloquently on the subject of anti-Semitism, which is a significant part of tonight's film. In particular, I'd like to point out a very recent contribution. He may be 90 years old, but you know, his productivity seems to increase over time. Halavai, this would be an example for all of us. And the new anti-Semitism is an article I can recommend to all of you that appeared in the American Scholar in the winter of 2006, which deals with some of the issues in historical perspective. I want just to give you one quotation before I ask Bernard to speak. And this comes from a book he published 20 years ago, more or less, Semites and Anti-Semites, which some of you may well have read. The quotation reads as follows: "The volume of anti-Semitic books and articles published, the size and number of editions, the eminence and authority of those who publish and sponsor them, their place in school and college curricula, their role in the mass media, would all seem to suggest that classical anti-Semitism is an essential part of Arab intellectual life at the present time, almost as much as it was in Nazi Germany and considerably more than in late 19th and early 20th century France. Wayne mentioned the word prophetic. I think that that view has certainly been borne out over the last 20 years, and particularly the last few years, and the very graphic material in this film, I think, substantiates that, if anything, it is maybe even surpassing its models in some areas, reaching new heights of irrationality, paranoia, and ubiquity with no end in sight. But that I will leave to Bernard to elaborate on, and any other aspect of the struggle of radical Islam against the West. So the stage is yours. There, that's fine.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is this working all right? Can you hear me? I've learned by long experience to ask that question before getting down to business. Time is short and there's a great deal to discuss, so I'll come straight to the point. We use the word Islam commonly in two related but distinct senses. We use it as the equivalent of Christianity. That's to say, a religion in the strict sense of that word, a system of belief and worship and scripture with some kind of professional organization that discharges its functions. We also use Islam in a much broader sense as the equivalent of Christendom. That's to say, a whole civilization which grew up under the aegis of that religion, but which contains many elements that are not part of that religion, elements even that are in a very basic sense contrary to that religion. As an example of what I mean, let me take the Nazis, to whom we've had a number of references during the last hour. No one could seriously argue that Hitler and the Nazis came out of Christianity. But no one could seriously dispute that they came out of Christendom. I think that should suffice to make my point clear. It is common practice, both in the Muslim world and in the rest of the world, to use the word Islam in these two senses, these two related but different senses. And therefore I think it's important to bear this in mind, considering whether this or that or the other thing is essentially part of Islam, is characteristic of Islam, whether Islam as such can be blamed for it, and so on. Sorry. Many of the things which we have seen in this film are part of Islam in even the narrow sense. Others are part of Islam, if at all, only in the very broad sense. The public discussion about Islam in modern times has been very wide and very varied, and we're, generally speaking, being given two different versions. According to one, we have told, and we hear this phrase repeatedly, Islam is a religion of peace. Rather like the Quakers, but without their aggressiveness. On the other hand, we have the image of Islam as a religion of bloodthirsty fanatics, symbolized by the warrior riding out of the desert on horseback with the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other, offering his victims the choice between the two. It's a familiar image. Well, Islam is a religion of peace, but not in the sense in which that is stated. Muslims are nowhere commanded to love their enemies or to turn the other cheek. Their attitude to such matters is, I would say, closer to smiting the Amalekites, which would be familiar to us. The Sorry, I seem to have a dry throat today. On the other hand, well, let me deal with the alternative first. The other image, that of the fanatical warrior riding out of the desert with the sword in one hand and the Quran in the other, is not only untrue, it's impossible, unless we are to assume a race of left-handed swordsmen. The left hand, by tradition, is reserved for unclean purposes. No self-respecting Muslim would ever raise the Quran in his left hand. No, the truth is in its usual place, somewhere between the two extremes. Islam does lay down a certain level of tolerance. According to our modern notions, tolerance is in itself an intolerant idea. But for a long time it was the best that was available. And for many centuries, the movement of refugees was from Christendom to Islam, not from the Islamic world to Christendom. But things have changed. There is also the question of the attitude to war and peace. Islam is not, as is formal Christianity, opposed to war. War is accepted as a necessary part of reality, and there is indeed a notion of what is usually translated holy war, the conventional translation of jihad. But because it is part of the religion, it is also part of the holy war. And being part of the holy law, it is elaborately regulated. Islamic law, like Jewish law, like rabbinic law, was developed over a long period by a whole series of reasoning processes using both scripture and tradition and argumentation as well. And the Islamic law is a very complex structure which devotes a considerable section to the conduct of war. And there are the laws of war, what you may do, what you may not do. And these are vastly different from the kind of approach to war and struggle which we have just seen in this film. It is necessary, according to the Sharia, holy law, to give a proper declaration of war, to give due warning, to conduct warfare according to certain rules, which many things are forbidden, and not to attack non-combatants, and so on and so on and so forth. The question of suicide, for example, in the Muslim view, suicide is what we would nowadays call, or what the Western world would call, a mortal sin. This is expressly forbidden by the holy law. And not only that, but we are told what is the punishment of suicide. If anyone commits suicide, even if he has lived a life of unremitting virtue, he forfeits paradise and goes straight to hell. And his eternal punishment in hell is the endless repetition of the act of suicide. An imaginative punishment, I think you all agree. So that one who hangs himself can look forward to an eternity of strangulation. One who poisons himself to an eternity of bellyache. And presumably the suicide bombers to an eternity of exploding fragments. So you may ask, well, how then do we get to this? Well, a lot of strange things have been happening quite recently. And let me turn now, since time is short, to some of the more recent developments in the Islamic world, and particularly in the self-perception of Muslims. But first, a word or two of introduction on that. There are many religions in the world, all of which believe that their truths are universal. But most of them fall into the category of what is sometimes known as a relativist religion. They believe that just as humanity has invented many different languages to talk to each other, humanity has invented many different religions to talk to God, and God understands them all equally well. Well, perhaps not equally well, but understands them all. This is a view which is clearly stated in the Talmud, for example, where it is said that the righteous of all peoples have a place in paradise. The other view, sometimes known by its critics as the Triumphalist view, a view which is summed up in the classical formula, I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell. The triumphalist perception of religion would run something like this. We are the fortunate recipients of God's final message to humanity, which it is our duty not to keep selfishly for ourselves like the Jews, but to bring to all humanity, removing whatever obstacles there may be on the way. Triumphalist religions basically have been two, Christianity and Islam. And given that these two religions shared this self-perception, and in addition to that shared a great deal of the culture, the past, the history, the experience, and the neighborhood in which they lived side by side, given that conflict between the two, the competition for the privilege of enlightening all humanity, was waged for many, many centuries. The unending series of jihad and counter-jihad and crusade and counter-crusade and the like. Now, in the Christian world, this triumphalist approach has almost disappeared. Not quite, but it has almost disappeared. And it is certainly not in any part of Christendom the dominant view. Not even in the Vatican, for example, where we have seen not long ago the spectacle of a pope apologizing to the Muslims for the Crusades. Rather remarkable if one considers that the Crusade was really a late, limited, and incompetent imitation of the Jihad. The triumphalist approach in Islam did continue. And it's hardly surprising if we remember that Christianity is now in its 21st century and Islam is in its 15th. It takes a little while to get over these things. Triumphalist Islam received an enormous encouragement, an enormous stimulation in one of the most important events of recent history, namely the defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union. We are accustomed to think of that as a Western, and some would say more specifically, an American victory in the Cold War. Many Muslims see it differently, as a Muslim victory in the Jihad. And remember how it happened. The Red Army was defeated by the Taliban in Afghanistan, driven from Afghanistan in defeat and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that when the Muslims claim the defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union as their victory, this is, to say the very least, not implausible. The subsequent development of ideas and attitudes we can follow fairly closely thanks to a man you may have heard of called Osama Bin Laden, who expresses himself, his views and his opinions, his perceptions, I should say, with great elegance, eloquence, and clarity. As he saw it, there has been a cosmic struggle going on between the two rival religions, the two rival world religions, Islam and Christianity, since the advent of Islam in the 7th century of the Christian era. We can even document it. If you look at the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock, not very far from here, you will see it stated, well, first of all, the position, a site sacred in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the architecture related to the early Christian churches, and the text engraved inside the dome. He is God, he is one, he has no companion, he does not beget, he is not begotten. In other words, an explicit challenge to Christianity. The caliph was saying to the emperor, your time has passed, your religion is superseded, move over, we are taking over the world. And that has remained the attitude from then onwards. Coming back to Osama bin Laden, he describes how the caliphate, which headed the Muslim world, was held by a number of different dynasties in a number of different places, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, finally Istanbul, and then came the moment of utter final shame when the caliphate was abolished by the Turkish Republic and the last Muslim states defeated and subjugated. Similarly, as he sees it, the Christian world was ruled by a succession of different empires and dynasties, which it was the Muslim duty to fight, until the final stage in which it was disputed between two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And as he puts it, we have now successfully defeated and destroyed the more dangerous, the more deadly of the two. Dealing with the pampered and effeminate Americans will be easy. It now remains to complete the job and achieve the final triumph of Islam. That view was encouraged by the events of the 90s, when we saw a series of attacks on American installations in various places in the world, the embassies in East Africa, a warship in the Yemen, various barracks in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, bringing either minimal or totally ineffective responses. Angry words, expensive missiles dispatched to remote and uninhabited places, but otherwise nothing. One attack even in the United States. As they saw it, this was a crescendo leading up to the final phase, the first phase to expel the unbelievers from the lands of the believers, the final phase to bring the true faith to the lands of the unbelievers and establish the universal triumph of Islam. I think there can be little or no doubt that what happened on 9/11 was seen as the culmination of the previous process and the inauguration of the new process. And the response to it came as a shock. They had expected more of the same. They knew that there had been an election, but in their experience, elections don't change policies, don't change governments. Governments change elections. What happened since has come as a surprise and brought a need for some reassessment. And we could see that again in their websites, in their broadcasts and so on. They have great difficulty in understanding what is happening in the Western world because the free debate of an open society in which opposition and criticism are perfectly possible without necessarily meaning disloyalty or insurrection, that is alien and incomprehensible. And therefore their readings have been mostly misreadings. This still goes on, and it is fascinating to see how they interpret this, how they see it. Now, the role of anti-Semitism in this is the final point which I want to discuss briefly. I think we have to be careful in using the word anti-Semitism or anti-Semite to understand precisely what we're talking about. I will say something which may strike you as absurd, but if you will think for a moment, I think you'll agree that it makes sense. It is perfectly possible to hate Jews, even to persecute Jews, without being anti-Semitic. That strikes you as nonsense. It isn't. What I mean is this: hating people who are different, persecuting people who are different, even on occasion massacring people who are different, is part of the normal human condition. We find it all through history. We find it in every part of the world, in every civilization. Anti-Semitism is distinct in that it attributes to the victim, to the Jews, a kind of quality of cosmic evil, the like of which cannot, as far as I am aware, be found anywhere else. In the history of Islamic civilization, Jews were variously treated. Sometimes they were fairly well treated, sometimes less well. On the whole, not too badly. But anti-Semitism in that sense was simply unknown. It did not exist. It was even explicitly refuted when attempts were made by Christian minorities in the Middle East to introduce it. We have, for example, fermans by Ottoman sultans denouncing and condemning the blood libel, saying Jews are accused of this, this is nonsense. The anti-Semitism in the European form was introduced from Europe. It came through diplomatic and ecclesiastical channels. And unfortunately, in modern times, it has been thoroughly adopted, assimilated, and Islamized. The really major advance of anti-Semitism came in an episode which you saw parts of in the film we've just seen, the intensely close relationship between the Nazis and the Palestinian leadership at one time, which extended well beyond the Palestinian leadership. The Germans were able to establish themselves in Syria, thanks to the Vichy surrender, to expand from Syria into Iraq, to create what later became the Ba'ath Party, the model for which is the Nazi Party, and to lay the foundations of a real Nazi-type anti-Semitism in the Arab Islamic world, which has since passed to other parts of the Islamic world. It has, as I said, been adopted, assimilated, and Islamized, and we can see that in many different ways, and it is one of the major problems which we have to confront today. My time is up, so let me conclude with, one always likes to end on a more happy note. Mention was made of my book, Semites and Anti-Semites, which deals rather severely with the growth and development of Arab anti-Semitism. This book has just been published in Cairo in an Arabic translation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that panoramic, erudite, and concise view of so many different facets. Because we are on a very tight schedule, the maximum I can really allow is just 2 questions, and whoever's fast enough is going to get the benefit, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to close it. But if there are no questions, I'm quite happy to call it a day. Okay. So would you mind going to the mic, or at least introducing yourself, just identifying yourself?
Perhaps I can finish with my story about
Yeah.
the underdog.
My name is Roger Hertz. I happened to come across the article in Jerusalem Post today on what he said about Europe. Can you please elaborate whether or not you were correctly quoted, and elaborate a little bit about those ideas?
I'm sorry.
Could you speak a little more clearly, because it wasn't entirely audible?
Yes. I came across the article in the Jerusalem Post today,
Yes.
in which you were quoted regarding the future of Europe.
Ah, yes, yes.
I'd like to ask if you were correctly quoted, and if you could elaborate, please.
Yes, the question is about the rapid advance of Islam in Europe. The point which I made when I was invited to the Post for what I was told was an editorial briefing, I didn't realize it was an interview. In my language, these are different things. However, let that pass. The point I was trying to make was about the rapid advance of Islam in Europe. And I don't think there can be any reasonable doubt about this. It's happening in several ways. There's the combination of immigration and demography. A delightful misprint. I said demography, but in the text it said democracy. The combination of immigration and demography, large-scale immigration, a high birth rate, a young and growing population, as contrasted with elderly and, shall we say, sexually inactive Europeans. The other thing which is bringing about the change is what I can only describe as the surrender mode of much of Europe in dealing with this. The unwillingness to enter into any serious discussion of the threat that Europe faces, and to be apologetic, a mood of self-abasement of what an American historian, J.B. Kelly, once described as the diplomacy of the preemptive cringe. A good phrase, I think you will agree. And all this led me to believe that unless there is a sudden and violent change, which is possible but unlikely, the combination of these processes of demography, migration, to which one must add, to an increasing extent, conversion, Islam will become the dominant religion in Europe. Now, I quoted a Syrian writer, though they left out the quotation, who said that the real question about the future of Europe is, will it be an Islamized Europe or a Europeanized Islam? I think that's a good formulation.
If there isn't a last question, I would just say, yes, there is. Okay. Final question.
Your analysis is brilliant. Do you have a solution? What should be our response? And to put you on the spot, do you think a direct confrontation with Iran would be the recommendation?
When you say solution to which problem do you mean? We're dealing with several. If you mean Iran, that's what you mentioned, I think there is only one solution to the problem presented by Iran, and that can come only from the Iranian people. Iran is a real threat, a mortal threat. I think one has to take the nuclear threat in Iran very seriously. One also has to take account of what I think can only be described as the apocalyptic mood of Ahmadinejad and his circle. In Islam, as in Christianity and as in Judaism, there is what you might call an end-of-time scenario. There will be final battles between the forces of good and evil. The Mahdi in Islam, Jesus, the returning Jesus, the Messiah for Jews, will fight against Gog and Magog, Dajjal for Muslims, or whatever else the adversary is called. There will be the final struggle, which of course will end in the triumph of the forces of good and the destruction of the forces of evil. Muslims have a similar scenario, and Ahmadinejad and his group clearly believe, and I don't doubt the sincerity of their belief, that that time is now, that we are now entering the apocalyptic age. The final battles are taking place between the forces of good and evil, and will result, of course, inevitably in the triumph of their messianic figure. And Muslims, like Jews, believe that one can take some steps to hasten the process. This, I think, is extremely dangerous and extremely alarming, because if you consider the situation during the Cold War, both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, had nuclear weapons. But neither side used them because each side knew that the other would retaliate in kind. This was known as mutual assured destruction, MAD for short. MAD doesn't work with these people because mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. They believe that the end of time will bring the triumph of their cause. If many of their people perish, they will be doing them a favor. They will be giving them a quick free pass to heaven and all its delights, to the divine brothel in the skies.
That inspires two thoughts. As you say, waiting for the Islamic Messiah is a very chilling prospect, something which I think tonight's film underlined, but it also inspired the thought that the reason why MAD will no longer work is that this time we're really faced with mad people, even if they have a method in their madness. But I would just like to take this opportunity to say two big thank yous. First of all, to the wonderful job performed by the Sixer staff. I know well just what a exploit it was to have in such a short space of time taken care of all the logistics of such a large audience and having to move from the Truman Center to this auditorium, and the fact that we had an event only last week. So I would like to say a very big thank you to Ruchama Roth. To Sarah Grosswald, and to all of our staff, including our young students who have done an inspiringly good job. But above all, I would like to thank Professor Bernard Lewis, who's given of his wisdom and his wit.